Conversations That Matter. This is part 2 of a conversation about domestic violence with my friends Scott Lancaster and Lenzi Dodgen. We are glad to have them continue the conversation about domestic violence. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so I hope you'll share the podcast with your family, with your friends, and have your own conversation about this really important issue. In part 1, which I hope you watched, we talked about what domestic violence is. What does it look like? And we talked about how prevalent it is in our society and the effects it has on children and communities. In part 2, we're going to talk more on why the victim stays and resources out there for folks to ask for help and what we can do as bystanders. So welcome back, Scott and Lenzi.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for continuing the conversation. I want to just kind of highlight what domestic violence looks like again,
Sure.
just in case someone missed part 1. Talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Sure. So I think that it's an ongoing conversation about how we define domestic violence. What does this mean? What does it mean to be to experience domestic violence? And there's a lot of different terms that we use, and I think one of the things that's problematic is that we don't really have a very broad or concise definition. We have different definitions that seem to make sense for different groups and different folks that are working within that movement. So, it can be called a lot of different things. It can be called intimate partner violence when you're speaking about the dyad of 2 people in a romantic partnership. And then it can be called a lot of different, obviously the most popular term that we talk about is domestic violence, but domestic violence actually is pretty inclusive of a lot of different things, such as family violence, violence against children and women, and so that can be inclusive. And so it really just kind of depends on what it is that you're really looking at and what you're actually trying to accomplish. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, I would say that domestic violence and what we're talking about is behaviors that are rooted in power and control of an intimate partner that are pervasive over time. And one of the terms that really resonates with me in some of the research that I have discovered is that there really is a description of terrorism within a relationship. And that term really resonates with me as someone who provides that direct service piece to folks who have had this experience. That seems to be a very applicable term to what someone may actually experience when you're speaking of domestic violence.
Yeah, because you never know what's going to happen, right?
Right. So it's that series of behaviors rooted in power and control of 2 people that is pervasive over time, that really kind of hijacks folks' feelings and how they behave and interact with the world.
Well, I think there's a really important question that I think so many people have, and folks that have never experienced domestic violence or intimate partner abuse is why do people stay?
Sure. I think, first of all, I'm really glad you asked this question, because I think that that's probably the most common question that folks get is, why did you stay? And I think it's rooted in all of us really having a very difficult time putting ourselves in their shoes and saying, what would you do? And so when you do that, when you put yourself in those shoes, it's really easy to say, well, I would never put up with that. Right. But the reality is that you don't know what you would do until you're in that situation. And there are a lot of folks that talk about the historical context of why they stay, why they leave, okay? And how those types of things, they happen over a period of time. So there's a couple of things that I want to cover with this question. Number one is there is a myriad of legitimate reasons why someone would stay in a relationship that looks like this, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But really what I want to go over first and foremost is it's the wrong question to ask. And the right question, and what I feel like is actually where we need to be and where we need to progress, is instead of asking the person that's having the experience of abuse, why are you staying? Why aren't we shifting our focus over to the person that's abusing and saying, why do you feel like you're entitled to that behavior? Because you're not, and it's not okay. And we need to start having more conversations with perpetrators. And the problem is that people don't want to identify as a perpetrator. Never, right? Nobody wants to do that. We over-identify with survivors and victims and say, oh, let's focus on this person. And what we've done inadvertently, unintentionally, is started victim blaming and saying, it's your job. Why do you stay? Meaning it is your job to pull yourself out of this abusive situation that this person really has been stripped of all power and control. So you're asking the person who has no control within the dyad to be responsible for pulling themselves out of it, when in fact, that's the wrong question. The question should be, why do people abuse? Why do people feel like that's okay to do that to their partner that they're intimately involved with?
Why do you think it happens?
Why do I think abuse happens? Like intimate partner abuse? I think that probably goes back to a lot of the power dynamics and the gender constructs that we have. There's a lot of different reasons why these types of things start to happen within a home. I think it goes back to some of the things that Scott was talking about, where sometimes we don't really value what the role and what the person brings to the relationship. There doesn't seem to be a fitness. Where if you have one person that really values independence and autonomy, but you also have someone, but you're in a relationship with someone that has a lot of dependence, that can really cause a lot of problems within
a you can create dependence. And a lot of the power and control is creating dependence. You know, and you know, the conversations when we're working out at the shelter, we have conversations about why folks ended up sticking around, and you know, when folks in that initial healing phase, and they're still, you know, they're still putting the pieces together and trying to understand how they came to be where they are. You know, they don't really know the answers. I mean, they know the surface ones. Well, you know, I stayed because I fell in love with this person, right? And that's how I want to continue to see them, through that lens of who I met. You know, and sometime later, I had made compromises with myself, and I can put up with this. And, you know, it's, you know, for a lot of folks, and as Lenzi had mentioned earlier about not wanting to identify as an abuser, you know, because of that, you know, that definition. I think part of it is because of the word violence, but, you know, we identify with the physical nature of domestic violence, which is really a very small proportion of it. It's really small. And, you know, so I can say to myself, well, I'm not a domestic violence perpetrator until I'm punching her in the face.
Right, which is completely untrue. That's the
mythology. It's completely untrue.
That's completely untrue. And
talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like, because you can't see the manipulation and control like you can a bruised eye or a busted jaw. You can't see the fear and the terror like you can someone that's been beat.
Right. So someone who behaves this way, who feels entitled to this type of behavior, they don't walk around with the label of monster on their forehead. They're often cloaked in charm and charisma and really affectionate things, all the good things that really sort of draw us in. And so when those types of things happen, we feel so foolish. On the flip side, going like, oh gosh, why didn't I see these things happening? They were happening right in front of me. Well, you didn't see them happening because he wasn't punching you in the face every day. He was actually being really affectionate and very loving and kind and generous, and all the things that were beautiful and wonderful. Like, those things were present too within your relationship. You know, within domestic violence and the cycle of violence that happens within that intimate partner dyad, it's not always the explosive apex moment of confrontation, okay? There's a cycle there that happens. There's a lot of different things that happen in the downtime that keep someone, develops that dependence and keeps that person present, right? So, you know, you ask why, you say, well, there's a myriad of reasons. And first and foremost, because there are cases out there where if you leave, you are at imminent risk of death.
Yeah.
Okay, and so really at the fundamental part here is that if you say you care about life, if you genuinely care about life, then you're going to care about and you're going to trust that person to tell you, if I leave, I die. And you're going to trust that person because that person is the expert on their life and their abuser, and then you're going to safety plan the heck out of it to try and save their life, because ultimately that is what we care about. Life. You deserve to live. You're worthy of living.
Is that the most dangerous time, is when a victim tries to leave?
So there's two times that it's really, really...
Because everything they've heard in the past.
Well,
yeah, so there's two moments.
Well, here's what's happening. It's the moment that you take power back from the power broker.
I'm done.
That's
and
because what they're trying to do is they're trying to regain power, right? They're trying to regain control.
Well, it was like in part one, you talked about that box. Now, that resonated with me quite a bit.
Yeah.
And just briefly go over that again. But it's like as long as your victim stays in that box, you don't have to elevate that level of power or abuse.
No,
when it's elevated,
because you can control people in a lot of different ways.
Well, and it's really important not to. Again, I hate to say it. I don't hate to say it. I mean, it's the truth. It's really important not to. Say identify perpetrators of domestic violence as evil monsters, right? Because those ones that we hear about, the ones that are in the news, the ones that do really awful things, are not in the main. You know, the ones that are in the main are ones that haven't really had to do maybe too much work or too much to keep somebody in that box. And as long as you're in that box, you feel good, I feel good, I'm entitled to this, you're a part of my world that I have been raised, I've been programmed to be able to control, right? That's how we're taught growing up, that's sort of a sign of masculinity, that you're in control. Well, that includes your relationships. And so, you know, most batterers, most abusers, whatever word we want to use, they don't have these like schemes. They're just operating. You know, they're really just operating. And so,
most don't intend to do it.
Well, no. They absolutely intend. Their intention is to create
control
this.
By whatever means necessary.
Yes, and to create this picture.
Yeah.
You know, this picture has to look acceptable to those looking in. It has to look acceptable inside. It has to meet my personal needs, which, you know, there's a lot of reasons why there might, you know, it could just be I was raised to control. It could be some, you know, insecurity I have of myself, whatever. A lot of things feed that. But you know, ultimately, you know, that picture needs to look correct. So whatever I need to do to make that picture look correct, I'm going to do. And the vast majority of people don't have to use physical violence to get there. Now, a lot of the folks that we see out at the shelter, again, you know, people are at a point where they see no other way. You know, so that's why they're coming to shelter. So those are the stories that we are getting on a daily basis. But if you go out and you speak to people in the community and you start talking about domestic violence, and not necessarily that, you know, cops level of domestic violence where you see and the guys run away from the cops, but you start talking about just the dynamics and some of these less kind of nefarious, at least looking, ways that partners control other partners. And there's a ton of resistance. You see a ton of resistance from folks who are within the group of folks that we're talking about, right? And it's because it's hard to identify as any part of this picture, either as a survivor of domestic violence or as a perpetrator of domestic violence. It's hard to identify with that role. And, you know, again, this comes down to a basic understanding of what domestic violence is, a really common definition, you know, and not sensationalizing what it is. You know what I mean? You know, there's a lot of examples of how this works. There's a spectrum, right? And most of us fall somewhere in the spectrum of what we do and how we operate in our relationships, the things that we're willing to put up with, the things that we want to have in our control. You know, and there's a lot of examples in other things, like say rape, for instance. I mean, if you look at just a basic definition of rape, you have two people, and there's unconsensual sex, right? That happened. Okay, so that's rape. Now, whether I beat you into that, into saying yes, or I just bug you. On the surface, it looks very different. One looks really intense and scary, okay? But at the end of the day, in the beginning, you have one person that didn't want to, one person that did, and then it happened.
Yeah.
You know, so there's this spectrum of behavior, and we don't want to put ourselves on that spectrum. You know, because I certainly don't want to identify with those guys over there that are so easy to identify, right? And so
ignore behavior.
Yeah, and so being
box as
yes, and so being that controller in the relationship, you know, we don't necessarily want to identify with that. You know, one of our largest underserved populations here in the Central Bluegrass is middle class to upper middle class Caucasian women. You know, it's just because it's just something that happens, and you know, they're not coming to shelter, they're not making crisis calls. It's because of this sort of basic understanding that domestic violence is when he punches you. Right. Well, a lot of these folks, and this is where I get a lot of resistance when I go out and talk in the community about these kind of things, is, you know, a lot of these folks there's controls that have been placed in their lives. Yeah. A lot of it's financial, you know, and so ultimately it's like, you know, they had this idea of what a relationship looks like. They've become comfortable with that. So I'm not going to tell them, oh, well, you need to identify as a survivor. No, you don't. You get to identify however you want.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, these are controls that are put in place, and they're there for a reason. And, you know, those things will be stripped away from you if you don't toe the line. And so, you know, that simple, basic definition is it's just a relationship where one person's controlling the other. That's as simple as you can make it. And you know, there's a lot of different ways that you can control. There's the Duluth model power and control wheel that clearly illustrates a lot of those different ways. And you know, so to boil all of that down, that's really what it is. And you know, and I think as far as, you know, making changes towards that, it's everybody joining in on this conversation. It's people like myself, you know, people that I was born with a ton of privilege. I'm a guy, I'm white, you know, I've got all of these privileges put in place just by virtue of who my parents were. And you know, I'm not a bad guy because of that. I didn't do it on purpose. Right. I certainly didn't sign up for it, but I have to recognize those kind of things. I have to do everything I can do to not sort of take advantage of those privileges, you know, and to certainly not set the table for myself to put people in a lower sort of power structure than myself.
Is there a commonality among the threshold of victims being able to make that courageous decision to ask for help or to walk away? I mean, I know there are a lot of constraints, housing, financial, shame, fear, so many things that keeps a victim from asking for help or leaving. But is there a commonality among what breaks the camel's back, if you will?
No. There's usually there's probably some commonality, so I can't say that, but also it's an individual narrative, right? Everyone's story looks a little bit different, and that's unique to the individual and to their experiences. So, you know, there's two times when a survivor experiencing domestic violence in their intimate relationship, there are two times where this person is at most risk for harm or injury or death, and that is when you're leaving and during an explosive moment. Yeah. Okay, so those are the two times that are most dangerous for you. And so when you have those moments over and over again, each time you might come into contact with law enforcement, a family member, or an advocate, or there's different entry points where someone may come in. And typically, some of our research says that statistically it takes approximately, is it 7 times?
7 to 9.
7 to 9.
That's a weird stat.
It's an interesting stat. Yeah. So, you know, you have folks that say, I know that this is not okay for me. I know that I'm not safe. I can't leave right now for all the reasons that are legitimate, up to and including he might just kill me. Right. And in that moment, you're having different interactions with that person. It might be an emergency room person, or, you know, it could be, there's just a lot of different points of reference that folks come into this.
Are you saying there's 7 to 9 times when they have an opportunity to walk away, or they think they're going to walk away?
No,
it's 7 to times attempts to leave.
Oh, okay.
To leave.
Okay.
And whether that's having gone to a shelter or made some significant plans to make a change. You know, and again, that whole 7 to 9 thing, the reason why I feel like that's kind of a weird statistic is it starts to align this kind of behavior with, say, something like addiction, right? Where somebody might go to rehab so many times. And so, you know, again, and trying to be careful with those statistical sort of analyses is that
such a unique experience.
Well, and it removes the humanity from the situation, right? We're talking strictly about numbers. So it's very easy to put those two things together and be like, oh, well then DV or somebody being a perpetual survivor, for instance, oh, it looks a lot like addiction, right? You know, they have these emotional reasons kind of drawn back. Couldn't be more different.
There's nothing like it.
There's nothing like it, and the two are completely unrelated. But you know, so those statistics, you know, they're just kind of strange in the way that they can be perceived. They're strange in the way that they can be read into.
This is another problem with defining domestic violence within the scholarly world of academia. When you're doing a lot of research about domestic violence. There's a lot of statistical analysis out there that really sort of isn't very good. It's not very good, and part of that
focus away from the victim versus the.
I think that different researchers are measuring different things, and so they're coming up with different outcomes, and they're trying to say this is what it is,
well,
this is what
outcomes.
it is.
They're presumed outcomes.
Right,
so sometimes they will go for what they're looking for, right? They have a theory and they want to prove that theory, or you know, it's pretty rare that somebody goes in and it's just like, I don't know what's going to happen. We're going to gather some information and bang, that just doesn't happen. They've got an agenda.
There's a theoretical framework to work from.
Yeah.
So that's part of the problematic reasons for not having like a real comprehensive definition we can all sort of agree
But I think the
on.
big thing is it strips the humanity away from what it is that we're talking about. And we're talking about people that are making decisions based on their safety, based on you know, how they feel about themselves, their well-being, what kind of situation that might put in place for their kids. I mean, you know, I grew up an Army brat, so the notion of going to a different school is just not a big deal for me. But you know, Lenzi, my wife, lived here almost her whole life, and she had friends that she's had since she was 5 years old. I can't even wrap my head around that. But you know, that importance of being able to stay in a set of schools with your set of friends, it's so huge for people, and so that's a huge ask. I want you. Let me just say this. Okay, you are a middle class, upper middle class person who you've got 2 kids, ages say 6 and 3. Okay, what I want you to do is I want you to leave this home that you've built for yourself, all of the comforts. Because remember, in most relationships that are controlling, it's not bad 24/7, right? You know, there's a lot of work that's done to limit those bad moments, okay? But they still happen. But you're wanting to leave, so I want you to give up everything, okay? And try to start over with 2 kids, okay? Go live at a homeless shelter. All right, it's a DV shelter, but it's there because people are homeless because of domestic violence. And then I want you to somehow, you know, change everything. It's a huge ask.
It is.
And we're asking this of someone who, at least within their relationship, has been completely stripped of power and control, right? And again, it goes into that question, you know, why are we asking that question? Well, why didn't you leave? That's a big ask for somebody that doesn't have control, because leaving is a control move. At the end of the day, it's a huge control move, and it's a leap. And it's interesting, when we take crisis calls out at the shelter, you know, people will call in and they will talk about what's going on, and you know, and at the end of a lot of these calls, especially if they're, you know, they've never called anybody before, they'll say, okay, so what should I do next? You know, and our response is, we can't tell you what to do. Well, we're DV specialists. I can certainly highlight some escalation in behavior. I can certainly, you know, talk about how DV works and how this might fit into the framework of your life. But as Lenzi said before, you're the professional in your life. You've managed to keep yourself alive up to this point. Who better to come up with that response than you yourself? And that starts that empowerment piece, because again, when we're talking about people who have been stripped of power, well, the response to that is to help to restore. Because there is even an ownership sort of thing there when I say, oh, I'm gonna restore this power for you. No, I'm not gonna restore anything. All I'm going to do is I'm going to try to provide an environment where you're making decisions for yourself. Yeah. And so, and that's where we start. It starts right there in that first call.
Well, we've talked a lot about what domestic violence looks like and why the victim stays. Let's talk about how the victim can leave. What resources are out there? What does she or he need to do to get help? I know you're at Greenhouse 17 and provide a very valuable resource for women and children. What's the first step?
For a survivor.
Yeah, for a survivor.
Well, first there's 15 shelters located across the state of Kentucky. Each shelter has what's called an ad district, and that's a certain amount of counties around where that shelter is that they service. And they provide shelter services, but they also provide outreach services. Not everybody needs to come to shelter. Not everybody's ready to take that step, and people aren't thinking like, oh, I need to go that far to improve things for myself. So we service Fayette County and the 16 surrounding counties, essentially just one big circle. And that first step in getting in contact with us, usually our very first contact with people is in court. So they've gone to court, they might be filing for an emergency protective order or something along those lines, and we have advocates that work in the courts, and they make contacts with them. Hey, listen, I'm so-and-so, and here's what we provide, and if you are having a need or something, and maybe there's something we can do for you, that's where the first thing starts. And then sometimes it's the crisis call. Sometimes it's law enforcement calls us up and they've had a response to a home, and I don't want to say they don't know what to do, but they call us first. Like, look, this is bad. We need to bring this person in, and so we'll say, okay, we'll figure it out when you get here. Just come on in. And so, those are usually the first steps as far as survivors making contact with us. And a lot of it's word of mouth. That's why we do everything that we can do to be a presence in the community, to be a part of the festivals and all of those kind of things, have booths and everything. People need to know that we're out there. We do what we can to partner with other organizations, kind of build this network of support around people, because, ultimately we can't help people fix everything in their lives, but with this network of friends that we've made with other organizations, we can work on some pretty complex issues and help people to meet their own needs, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about the stigma around domestic violence and how it is a constraint to the victim asking for help. Do you think the more we talk about this among our family, friends, etc., that a victim is more apt to have that first conversation with someone that they trust? I like when you talk about being out of the community, building awareness, having a presence, so that people know it's a resource. You're a resource. Greenhouse 17 is a resource. What do we do as a community and families and friends to begin to chip away at that stigma, so that if a victim needs help, they may ask for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, if someone that discloses to you that this is happening to them, verbatim, your response should be, "Thank you for telling me," and I believe you.
I believe you too.
I believe you.
The opposite is happening, right? Non-verbally.
Why'd you say?
And it's not even the first.
Well, oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me?
Oh, come on, I know him. That didn't happen. It wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this
ways to
happens
water it
every
down.
day, right?
Lots
and
of
this
times.
is wrong. We should not be asking the question. We should not be assuming that he's a good guy and he might not do it.
Thank you for telling me.
We need to believe.
I believe you. I believe you. So I think when you speak about communities or we as individuals who are not part of the dyad, in other words, the perpetrator and the survivor. So when you're a person that is in that dyad, outside of them, friends, family, community members, church members, team players, things of that nature, where you can do that, there's a chance for all of us to, instead of identifying as one perpetrator or survivor, what we can actually identify as a bystander, and there's different levels of entry that we can do in order to be helpful and to keep our communities safer. And the notion of a bystander intervention is for you, when you see something, you do something, or when you see something, you say something. And so it, you know, not to be completely oversimplified with it, but ultimately, that's sort of the fundamental of it. Well, if you see something, say something.
What do you say to a coworker that says, I just don't want to get involved?
Okay, so that is, I'm really glad you asked that, because I think ultimately lots of folks don't want to be involved. And what I have to say about that is, wherever you are is the place you're supposed to be. What are you comfortable with doing, right? So not everyone is direct like me. So if I see a confrontation out here on this sidewalk, I might be direct and say, hey, is everything okay? This seems a little heated. How can I be helpful, right? Because I'm direct. But that may not be where other people start.
More passive bystander.
And that's okay, because the deal with bystander intervention is that you don't have to be ready to intervene upon a potentially dangerous situation. All you have to do is be ready to do something. And so there's different things that you can do. Maybe your path is to, if you're at a party and you see a couple that's arguing, maybe getting a little bit heated, maybe you're kind of worried that it may escalate to something, you intervene by spilling your drink. You intervene by knocking over a lamp. Not that I encourage property destruction, but also like maybe you turn the music or the lights off and say, oh, oops, my bad. When the lights come back on, we're all going to have a dance party or something. Something to diffuse the tension of the moment. The idea about being a bystander is to intervene before the violence has occurred. Okay, so think about some things that you can do. If you're driving down the street and you see two people kind of arguing and yelling and whatnot, there's really not a whole lot you can do when you're behind the wheel. So maybe you beep your horn and just beep it all the way down the street until they can't hear your horn anymore.
What do you do when your cousin or your sister or whomever says, we're fine, stay out of my business, nothing's going on?
Okay,
because
I'm just
sure
checking.
That happens too, right?
Okay, I'm just checking. Then I may get someone else to go intervene and be direct. There's a lot of different ways.
It takes a lot of courage to jump into a situation that you're not a part of.
I might say, my nephew is watching how you operate.
Yeah.
It is my business.
Right.
Because my nephew's paying attention, or your nephew, my son, is paying attention to how you're operating. It's absolutely my business.
And you're acting and responding and doing that in the vicinity of me, therefore it is my business. Of course. Now this is a direct way, right? So if I direct, if I turn, so if I think that people are being a bit aggressive or confrontational with one another, and I'm worried that it's going to escalate to violence, I may be direct with that person who's being the aggressor. I might intervene in that way, or I might intervene on the person that's maybe not the aggressor and say, are you okay? Would you like to come with me to the bathroom? Can I be helpful? Can I call someone? Things of that nature. And if someone says it's not your business, I'm very happy to say it is, because I'm standing here and this is happening in front of me. It is my business. Not everybody is okay with that, and that's okay too. You're like the whole point of being a bystander is to intervene where you feel most comfortable. So if you're not comfortable,
there's no right or wrong.
There isn't. If you're not comfortable doing it, delegate it off and let someone who is direct to do it. Delegate it out. If you're not comfortable with being direct or creating a distraction, go delegate it to somebody who will say, hey, knock it off.
And keep in mind too, we're undoing social norms. I mean, when you think about something like that old chestnut, what happens in a man's home? Okay, that's something that's woven into the fabric of our society. So those are things that we're trying to undo. That notion that you can do something like this and somehow it's not the business of the people around you. That's something that person thought that they were entitled to. Hence the defense of well, it's my business, I'll take care of it. Well, you're not taking care of it in a way that's healthy for anybody involved. So it is our business. So that notion of, you know, what happens in a man's home, we have to get rid of that.
Sure.
You know, or we have to at least stop, you know, living by that, you know, and again, there are constructs in our society that support those kinds of things. We have to get rid of that kind of stuff,
right.
that notion of privacy. We should all have the right to privacy, but not if that privacy is at the expense of those that you're supposed to be loving.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
So there's how you can not identify within the dyad and be a bystander and provide some type of intervention that you're comfortable with. I would never encourage an individual to intervene in a place that they felt completely unsafe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't do that myself. If anything, I'm gonna look out for number one, and I'm not gonna ask anyone to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that I think that whatever you are willing to do is pushing.
I mean, think about these definitions. How do we define domestic violence perpetrator? How do we define domestic violence survivor?
Yeah.
How do we define hero?
Yeah.
How do we define the word intervention? You know, we all have this notion. We've seen it in lots of movies. And most of us are just not in that place to be able to do those kind of things. And we have to change the definition of those things. There's a million ways that people can intervene on pretty much everything without putting themselves in danger, without making a direct confrontation. You know, sometimes you need to be clever and slick, and sometimes you just, as Lenzi said, delegate it. I'm just gonna call the police. I'm calling the cops. You know what I mean? And so, you know,
and
there's
that may
things.
be, even though it might be against the victim's wishes, it may be the step that that person needs to really consider what's happening to them.
There's a whole nother conversation, because as an advocate for survivors of domestic violence for the last 12 and a half years, that's a slippery slope. That's a really slippery slope. In the heat of the moment, who knows, maybe management mode takes over and you just sort of do, right? But when we start to think about those kind of things.
As we talked earlier, that's one of the most dangerous times, right?
A, it's one of the most dangerous times. B, you're not going home with this person.
Yeah.
Okay, after you've done this move.
You can make it worse.
Yeah. You know, so there's a lot of things to consider. And so, you know, it's more of a dicey, or it's more of a dicey prospect for me personally. Just because of what I've been doing. Absolutely not. And so, you know, and here's the deal. This is why we got to talk about these kind of things. You know, we're prepping for these moments. We're building up our own awareness and our own skill set around trying to change how people operate with one another in relationships. You know, and it's weird because we haven't been doing it up to this point. It's kind of new stuff.
Well, we're going to flash up on the screen the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and we're also going to give the Greenhouse 17 crisis line. If you're local here in Kentucky, you can call those folks. But can someone that's concerned about a situation, concerned about a friend, a family member, and they don't know what to do, can they also call these lines?
Absolutely.
And say, look, this is what I've seen, this is what I know, I don't know what to do.
Right.
I need help.
We field those calls all the time. What we do need to occur in order to bring somebody in, we need to speak with that person. And the reason why we need to speak with that person is because they need to make the decision to come in or to receive services. But we talk all the time to folks who call up and their family members or workmates or something along those lines. They're on the periphery of this relationship. And, you know, that's what we're there to do. And, you know, at any given moment, there's more than one person working out at the shelter at the time. So, you know, we field multiple calls and... You know,
I think as advocates too, we encourage the dialogue. We encourage that dialogue. So if you are a support person in whatever role
this
that
is
you
your
play,
lane, and if you have identified that as one way to knock down those constraints to people getting help, that's what we need to do. We need to hear what you're saying, and we need to act on that.
Well, and most of the time, people will actually report or disclose informally to someone they know and trust before they come in and disclose or seek services from, say, someone in a more professional, authoritative role, like law enforcement, medical staff, advocates. So you typically will hear like where someone has actually disclosed informally to someone they know and trust. And so if you've been entrusted with that information, you get to get our services too. Because now, even though you're not in the dyad, right? Even though you're not one of the two people involved in this, you are someone that can be a really positive support person, and you can really make a profound, impactful, meaningful change and experience with this person by simply saying, thank you for telling me, I believe you, I want to make sure I give you everything that I have, so let me, I need to make some phone calls, or if you want to make these phone calls, I can be with you. What do you need, right? It's really having that empathic response that when someone comes to you with darkness, you say, okay, I'll sit in the dark with you and I'll do it.
That's great. Yeah. Well, you guys have certainly given us so much to talk about. It is deeper than I had ever realized myself. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, if you got another 6 hours.
We'll go more.
There's so much to talk about. I do want to mention that, again, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and October 18th is #WearPurple Day. And we want everybody to put their purple ribbons on or purple shirts, and it's a way to promote conversations around domestic violence, right? Sure. And we'll have some information on our website, conversationsthatmatter.co, about the awareness campaigns going around, and Wear Purple. So don't forget to do that. And talk about it. Talk about it on social media. #WearPurple. I think certainly that is what I'm hearing from you guys, is the more we talk about it, the more the stigma will be chipped away at, and we can hopefully empower folks to get to a point where they can ask for help if they need it. Any closing thoughts from you, Lenzi?
Gosh, so many.
Yeah.
So let me start with, I'll just say that I'm really proud of the progress that we've made in our movement. Those who have come before me and those who are going to take over when I am old and tired. I'm really proud of our progress, and I'm really proud of where we are. We have seen a lot of things improve. We need to keep going. We need to keep going. We can't really afford to become fatigued on this, and I can assure you that women won't let you become fatigued. We just won't let you. This is our life. We're talking about our lives. This is our life. And so when that's happening, we certainly are not going to be quiet. We're not going to be shouted down, and we're certainly not going to get back in our box.
And we're going to join you.
Good.
We're going to join you.
Well, because this is for you too, right? This isn't domestic violence. Is not an issue for women, which some good men help with.
That's
right? This is for all of us. This impacts all of us in one way or another. So our circle is open and we're ready. We want you to come to this table. We need for our women to lead us, and then I need for men to go knock down the barriers and let women be at these tables and at these spaces where we've often been locked out of. Yeah.
Scott, closing thoughts? Deep subject.
No, everything goes really deep. Domestic violence is normal. Talking about it is not. That's what has to change.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, that's what has to change, and taking an introspective look into your own life is not as difficult as it might seem. It's a little risky. It's a little, just because of how we define ourselves within our masculinity. But it's when you start to break through some things, you start realizing that it's not that hard to make that leap. It might be within my community. There might not be a whole lot of support for me. My dad might be riding, my brothers, whatever. But there's people out there that are willing to embrace you for taking that kind of look in yourself. And at the end of the day, I need to keep my words to a minimum and just do a little bit more listening.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for kicking off this conversation, and I hope our listeners will take it to their kitchen tables, which may not be the best place for it. It's
not a bad place for it.
but
it starts somewhere.
It starts somewhere.
Right? It starts somewhere.
Yeah. And I want to thank the audience for taking time to watch and listen. You can learn more about Conversations That Matter at conversationsthatmatter.co. and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Remember, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. October 18th is hashtag Wear Purple Day. So I hope you will wear your purple and be part of this very important conversation.